A very well-known scripture is Proverbs 22:6, which says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Is that the most accurate translation based on the original Hebrew? Well, let's find out together on today's episode of All Things Apostolic. In the ancient Near Eastern culture, the training of children was very important. Although the community had religious leaders and sages, the family played an important role in religious and ethical instruction. Instruction was expected to be intentional, and there are multiple times in the book of Deuteronomy that refers to teaching the law to the children, who will then teach their children. Much of the book of Proverbs is in the form of father-son instruction. It's in the format of a father's godly advice to his young son or sons. Now, Proverbs 22:6 is a familiar maxim to most of us, and the King James Version reads, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Other popular Bible versions translate it similarly. The implication is that parents should provide training about how the child should live morally and in a godly way. And if the training is done well, then even when the child has grown old, he or she will not depart or turn away from the teaching they've received. Now, this probably goes without saying, but I do want to since we're talking about Proverbs, I just want to mention that Proverbs are not promises. Specifically, the phrase, "he will not depart from it," gives us the general principle that a child who has been properly trained won't depart from the godly ways. Unfortunately, we can point to many proverbs such as this one, and then think of examples when it didn't come true. Years ago, I used to teach at the K-12 level, and when I think back to some of the young people I taught, and then how they walked away from God when they were older, it's absolutely tragic. Sometimes there may have been issues in the family that contributed to the young person backsliding, but sometimes there was no obvious cause. The parents seemed like they were doing everything right, or at least the best they could, but for some reason, a child walked away from God. Even some Bible characters who are considered righteous, such as Noah, give us examples in which one or more of their children do not live for God. So while we're having this discussion about this verse, I just want to throw in this caveat, which I'm sure you know, that Proverbs aren't promises. They're not a guarantee. They're principles. They give us good guidelines to follow that generally come true. Okay, so let's get back to verse 6. Now, let's take a minute to look more closely at the Hebrew and see what it reveals. We're going to look at the whole sentence first, and then we'll come back and examine some of the words, or each of the words, more closely. Reading from right to left, it says, "Hanoch lana'ar al pi darko, gam ki yazkin lo yasur mimena." Now let's examine the words individually. The first word is a form of the verb chanach. It is an imperative, which is a command, and it's somewhat rare. It's actually only used 5 times in the Old Testament. It's basically translated as to train in this verse, but in the other 4 times it occurs in Deuteronomy, 1 Kings, and 2 Chronicles, it's translated as to dedicate. And it refers to dedicating a house. So the related noun, their verbs are also connected to a lot of nouns, and it's hanaha, means dedication or consecration, and is used in reference to the dedication or consecration of altars, the temple, and town walls. So I think in this case, the word training works, but it does also strongly relate to the idea of a child who is dedicated by the parents to the Lord and given moral training to be godly. The same root word can also refer to cultivating a taste for. So training is a process of cultivating a taste for the things of God. We spend time training them our children as a tangible way of dedicating them to God. So dedicating them it's not just words that we say, it's not just a promise that we make as parents, but it's the action of ongoing training, because we ultimately want them to grow up to seek God for themselves and to willingly dedicate their lives to fulfilling His purpose for them in the kingdom. Now, the next word is la na'ar. It begins with a preposition prefixed onto the noun na'ar, which is frequently translated as boy, a youth, or a lad. But it can also refer to a servant or even a person up to around 30 years of age. But the majority of time it does refer to someone young. Now, the next two words make an unusual combination. Al is a preposition that can be translated various ways, but usually it means upon, above, or over. But it can also have other meanings such as concerning or according. The next word is pi, which is a form of the noun pe, which means mouth. So one possible literal translation is on the mouth. Now, one thing we need to keep in mind is that translators are not just substituting words from one language to another. They're trying to convey the meaning as well. So often, the word-for-word correlation isn't going to read very well, or sometimes won't even make sense, especially if it's used in a figurative sense. So, for example, with the word the mouth, it is often used in reference to the entrance or the beginning of a place or a thing. So, some translators suggest that in this verse, the fact that the word mouth is there could be viewed as it's in the beginning of His way, and adding the word beginning in there because mouth could be having, in a figurative sense, that reference. The next word is darko. It is the noun derech, which typically means way or road. The end of the noun has a pronoun attached to it, which can be translated as his. So a literal translation is his way. It's not the way. Next, we have gam, and that's very straightforward. It just means and. The next word is ki, and that's a conjunction. It's usually translated as that, for, or when. And in this case, I think when fits very well. Zakin is a form of the verb zakein, which means to be or to become old. So it can be translated as old or become old or grow old. The next word is lo, which is a negative particle that's usually translated as not, and that definitely fits in this context. It is connected to the verb yasur, which is a form of the verb sur, which can mean to depart, remove, turn away, or turn aside. So it can be literally translated as he will depart or he will turn aside. All of those words are built into that one word. Last, we have the word mimena, which is the preposition mean, which means from, paired with a suffix. So the translation is from it. So now that we've examined each word, you can see that there are several possible ways to translate the verse literally, depending on how we translate each individual word and how it best fits the context of the sentence. One way is train up a child according to his way, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And let's compare that more literal translation to the King James Version. The phrase, the way he should go, is in the Hebrew literally on the mouth of his way. So the common translation of should in English, the way he should go, I just want to emphasize that that's not actually part of the original wording. Now, most English translations of this verse do include the word should, but the original Hebrew doesn't really support or justify that translation. One could argue that his way is an elliptical means for saying the way he should go, but there are no other biblical examples to support that expansion of the idea. So the word derech, or way, has pronominal suffixes, meaning it has a suffix attached to it 25 times alone in the book of Proverbs. And they're translated as his way, his ways, her ways, their way. None of them are rendered as the way he should go, or she should go, or they should go. So in the 25 times it's in Proverbs, that concept of should is not incorporated any of the other times. So there is another explanation, or another possible explanation. The book of Proverbs uses figurative language like similes and metaphors, comparisons and contrasts, and repetition. Could it also use sarcasm? Well, one scholar suggests that when read this way, the verse is actually a warning for parents. So listen to it this way and see what you think. Train up a child in his way, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Meaning, so if you train up a child according to his way, meaning you give in and let the child act on natural impulses and proclivities, instead of providing loving discipline, then you will actually reinforce those tendencies toward sinfulness. And when the child is old, barring some type of supernatural intervention, he won't be able to depart from that type of life. And there are other verses in Proverbs that highlight the dangers of not disciplining children. He that getteth wisdom loveth his own soul. He that keepeth understanding shall find good. Proverbs 19:8. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. Proverbs 22:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. Proverbs 29:15. These verses emphasize the importance of disciplining children and not leaving them to follow their own way. So that gives some weight to the interpretation that views the verse more as a warning. Again, the idea is train up a child in his way, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. It's like an ironic, kind of a sarcastic command. And that's not actually uncommon in Proverbs. For example, look at Proverbs 19:27. It's a little more difficult in the King James Version, but in the ESV, it's a little clearer. And the ESV, English Standard Version, says, "Cease to hear my instruction, my son, and you will stray from the words of knowledge." So the speaker is using sarcasm to make a point. He doesn't really want his son to stop hearing his instruction. Now, interestingly, the Jewish interpretation tends to be more positive. The Stone edition of the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, translates this verse as, "Train the youth according to his way, even when he grows old, he will not swerve from it." So the translation recognizes the more literal translation of his way, but does not see it as being negative. They view the idea of his way as meaning that education should be somewhat individualized. The commentary in the Stone edition of the Tanakh says that the effect of a proper upbringing is lifelong, but in raising a child, parents and teachers must take careful account of his ability and personality. And there are other commentaries that pick up this same idea, saying that intellectual, moral, and spiritual education should be adapted for each individual based on their character and capacity, with a thoughtful regard to that individual's future calling in life. Judaism teaches that human beings are not basically sinful, so their worldview in this way shapes how they interpret this verse, and they see his way as meaning that education should be personalized or customized to the individual to shape his future according to his abilities and interests, rather than seeing his way as something negative. So we've looked at 3 possible interpretations. The most common by far with the English translations is the idea the parent should train up a child in the way they should go. It's an exhortation to parents. But since the Hebrew actually talks about training up a child in his way, then there are a couple of other possible interpretations. One is that it's a warning using kind of sarcasm in a, train up a child in his way, right? It's a caution to the parents. Or it's instructing the parents to customize instruction to the individual child. Train him up in the way that is appropriate for him. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on which interpretation you think is most accurate. And thank you for tuning in today for All Things Apostolic. See you next time. God bless.